Hi, I'm Nancy Sager. I think you can hear me. I'm going to try to be not as boring as that title is, exploring the attitudes and beliefs of audiology students towards deaf people. Um, but there you go. There is the interpreter. But this is the title that I gave my thesis, Exploring the Attitudes and Beliefs of Audiology Students Towards People Who Are Deaf or Hard of Hearing. Um, and like I said, I will try not to be as boring as that title. The next title, the next slide. So, a little bit about me. I took my first sign language class in 1973, which I'm thinking is probably before most of you were born. And my teacher was Bill White, to whom I dedicated the study. I graduated from UCSB in 1974 with a degree in anthropology, and I started studying deaf education at Fresno State University in 1974. When I started teaching, we were required to use C signs. There were no deaf people on the staff, and all of the students were required to use their voices, even though they signed at the same time, and even though their voices were sometimes not intelligible. I was disturbed by the clinical nature of deaf education. I still am. And that's a little bit about me. I was a teacher of the deaf for 14 years, a principal for 7 years. I was in Sutter County, not in Sacramento, and deaf and hard of hearing consultant at California Department of Education for 18 years. Next slide. So, research shows that sign language does not interfere with spoken language, and you can see the list of people who have researched that. The next slide. But the problem of practice is that some audiologists, speech language pathologists, and teachers of the deaf continue to advise students or parents not to sign with their deaf children. And for purposes of this presentation only, I will use the word deaf to mean whether a child is unilaterally or bilaterally hearing, or whether the degree of hearing loss is mild to profound. Next slide. My bias is that I do not believe that there is a place for autism or the belief that hearing people are superior to deaf people amongst professionals who work with deaf children and their families. However, I believe that many professionals in the field of deaf education are autists, and perhaps they are autists subconsciously. I do not believe that all audiologists are autists. And I do not believe that audiologists are the only professionals in deaf education who may be autists. I chose to do this study about audiologists, because they are the first professionals who parents of deaf children meet. And I chose students because I wanted people who did not have firmly developed professional opinions. Next slide. So the research question was mainly, what are the attitudes and beliefs about audiology students about people who are deaf? But secondly, what are the attitudes and beliefs of audiology students about sign language? And a second sub question that grew out of this study was not an original question, was what are the attitudes and beliefs of audiology students about their role in the educational system as it relates to deaf children and their families. Next slide. So I used the theory of general systems theory, which tells us that systems change over time based on feedback. And in this case, the feedback is from deaf adults. And the educational system may be more resistant to change because of autism. The general systems theory is viewed through the lens of critical disability theory. These are some of the theorists and researchers who have talked about critical disability theory. It replaces the older medical model with the newer social cultural model, and it is transformative in nature. So it hopes that people will change from a medical model to a social cultural model. Next slide. So I did a qualitative case study, which is a study of um, an exploration of a bounded system. And in this case, the system was a particular audiology um, audiology coursework, and it was on the west coast of the United States. I cannot tell you where. Anyway, next slide. The instruments I used were the Attitudes to Deafness scale, which was revised with permission from its main author, Dr. Rose. It was in 2004 and it was old. There is a newer test of implicit beliefs, but I contacted Harvard University, which does that study, and asked them if they had a study about deafness. And they said they did not. And when I asked them, would they consider developing one, they said yes, if I had $10,000, which I did not. So um, that didn't happen. I did also one-on-one interviews with 6 audiology students, and I chose different artifacts. They were readings from the deaf culture class that the students were taking, and then the scopes of practice of the American Speech and Hearing Association, ASHA, and the American Academy of Audiology, the AAA. Next slide. The participants were 19 students who took the Attitudes to Deafness scale. There are 22 items on that scale, and there is a 6-point Likert type scale that addresses the issues. The 6 students participated in 1-hour interviews, and I chose the 3 highest scorers and the 3 lowest scorers on the Attitudes to Deafness scale to do the interviews. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice for some reason. Next slide. So the data analysis was that the Attitudes to Deafness scale was scored by hand and reported in a table. The interviews were scored by 3 individuals: me, a deaf doctoral student, and a hearing audiologist. And the reason I did this was that it was actually the deaf person on my committee who said, you know, your bias is pretty clear, and you want to make sure that your bias doesn't show in your analysis of the interviews. And so I had the interviews analyzed by 3 different individuals, and those are the 3. I used a deductive approach using Dr. Benedict's categories of medical versus social cultural. And I used an inductive approach, which allowed for themes to grow out of the data. The archival data was coded using the deductive and inductive approach. Next slide. So, reliability and trustworthiness were that the attitudes to deafness scale was assessed using the Cronbach scale. And I think it was a 7.1 relationship, which showed a good reliability. Triangulation, I used multiple sources of data. I used the attitudes of deafness scale, I used the interviews, and I used the archival data. And I also had the data analyzed by 3 different coders. And then thirdly, I did an audit trail, which meant I just wrote down everything that I did and hoped that that would keep me honest. Next slide. On the finding of the attitudes to deafness scale was that 18 of the 19 participants um, scored in the social cultural range. I was surprised by this, actually. The one person who scored in the medical range did not leave their email address, so I could not contact that person. So I only interviewed people who scored in the social cultural range. And again, I was very surprised that they scored in the medical, I mean, not in the medical, in the social cultural range on the attitudes of deafness scale. Next slide. The findings on the interviews. Well, I interviewed the 3 of the lowest scoring students, Casey, Blair, and Tony, and 3 of the highest scoring students, Hayden, Bailey, and Terry. I did give them all gender non-specific names. And I did, although I will say that the students were not who I expected. I expected all white women. And in fact, I had one Asian student, one, um, no, two Latino students, and 2 of the students were males. So, next slide. The inductive within case analysis showed that every student had a mixture of medical and social cultural beliefs. So I analyzed the students individually, and I also did it with the deaf student and the audiologist, and we found that every student had a mixture of medical and social cultural beliefs, and it didn't matter where they scored on the attitudes of deafness scale. So one student who scored really high on the attitudes of deafness scale did not think that anybody should any parent should be referred to a deaf adult. She said, absolutely not. And yet it was one of the students who scored the lowest on the inductive analysis, on the attitudes of deafness scale, who said, oh, maybe students who are deaf should go to a deaf school because maybe they'd feel more normal there. And so it didn't really matter where they scored on the attitudes of deafness scale. Next slide. So some examples of within case analysis of the inductive analysis on the medical side, where a child is successful if they are successful in their parents' communication choice. Next, it's important for children to feel comfortable with their normal, and normal meant hearing, peers. It's important to provide sounds to deaf children because of the window of opportunity for sound. The audiologist has to get a feel for the family before referring parents to deaf adults. Deaf culture is too rigid and hard. It is too selfish. It is limiting and it is exclusive. But some of the attitudes that were expressed were social cultural, and some of these attitudes were expressed by the exact same people. It would be great if parents learned ASL because technology can only go so far. Hearing aids will never fix a person. Deaf children Deaf children's needs would be better met at a deaf program specific to deaf and hard of hearing children. Alexander Graham Bell wanted to pretty much get rid of deaf people, and that kind of formed the community and culture. And that success has nothing to do with the ability to hear. Next slide. In the deductive or cross case analysis, what are the attitudes and beliefs of audiology students about people who are deaf or hard of hearing? And again, um, the deductive analysis allowed um, themes to grow out of the analysis, out of the interviews. This is my dog, by the way. Next slide. The use of medical terminology. I found that the students tended to use medical terminology. For example, hearing loss, a moderate sensory neural hearing loss, or type of hearing loss, or kids that have a large hearing loss. They use the term communication options. An audiologist always presents both options, although sometimes the meaning of communication options was social cultural. So, for example, I feel like you're not allowing students to thrive if you won't let them explore their best options. Or talking about stopping signing when a kid gets a cochlear implant. You shouldn't take that option away. They use the word normal, referring to themselves as normal. It's important for deaf children to function normally as possible and to be integrated in society. Or parents never get to enjoy that baby as normal. And they pretty much agreed, and all three of us agreed that the students agreed that it is better to be hearing than to be deaf. Parents need time to accept that their baby isn't perfect. It's the duty of the audiologist to inform the parents of how bad it is. Next slide. They had a difference between hard of hearing and deaf. They talked about this. They said the difference between kids who can benefit from regular amplification and kids who can't benefit from regular amplification is the way you decide the difference between deaf and hard of hearing. Hard of hearing kids can still hear. They might just need constant clarification, like they'll ask, "What?" a lot. However, several students said they would never use the words deaf or hard of hearing with parents. They would use the term hearing loss so the parents would not, and I quote, fly off the handle, unquote. Next slide. The options were for deaf children. Some students expressed it as a this or that approach. They did tend to express it as the technology route versus the ASL route, which surprised me because I don't see them as being, first of all, I don't see them as being mutually exclusive. And secondly, I don't see technology as being the opposite of ASL. The two students who scored the lowest on the attitudes to deafness scale were clear that they would encourage parents to choose the technology route. They would be able to develop speech and language normally, hopefully. One student was open to bilingualism. We need to give the kid every single thing we can to succeed and let the child, when they're older, decide. And all parents agree that it is ultimately up to the deaf person to determine if they want to use signed or spoken language or both. But there was disagreement about when that deaf person has the right to make that decision. Some people believe that it was the parent's choice. Some people believe that the parents should follow the child's lead. Next slide. And this was a huge shock to me, is that options are only for deaf children. They are not for hard of hearing children. I was hugely surprised by this. They said that the options are only for parents whose kids have severe to profound bilateral hearing levels. That kids with mild to moderate hearing levels, typically they're the kids we just fit with amplification right away and just monitor. They're the kids where you don't need to really put any sort of options out there. They can just do like a hearing aid, which would help them. I was hugely shocked by this. Next slide. They talked about a critical period for listening and spoken language development. They said, I know that language has a critical period and that if you're not getting access to those sounds, then you're not developing them. That if you miss it because you can't hear, then I don't think you can ever get it back. Two students mentioned that auditory deprivation causes reading delays. I know that's why, like reading and writing, they're harder for someone who's deaf because they don't have phonemic awareness. They said a lot of research has said how deaf children can only achieve a certain level of education in reading and writing. Next slide. They talked a lot about isolation. The topic of isolation came up in relation to deaf adults, whether they are born deaf or whether they are late deafened. Some children are bullied because they are deaf. Deaf children may feel more comfortable at a deaf school. And isolation can just destroy someone. Next slide. Then I was pretty surprised by this too, that deaf culture exists and should be respected. Actually, I was surprised that I wasn't so surprised by that. They said when you look at the way like certain minority groups have been treated throughout history, having those like adverse feelings towards others who have wronged you in the past, it's a common trend throughout everyone in our history. That wasn't surprising to me. But that three students felt that deaf culture discriminates against individuals who are hard of hearing oral deaf, or use a cochlear implant or hearing aid was surprising to me. Deaf culture was described as selfish, limiting, wrong, exclusive, and unfair. Someone said it's a dying culture. I was surprised by that. Next slide. So, what are their attitudes and beliefs about sign language itself? They said that ASL is a true language. The four students who had had sign language before said they wished they could sign better. The two students who scored the lowest on the attitudes to deafness scale did not say that. But they all agreed that spoken language is preferable to ASL. I think it's easier to succeed in the world we live in with auditory oral, as unfair as that is. So they were apologetic about it. The child will benefit more if they do speak. I think the child will be better off in a sense, as bad as that kind of sounds. Again, they were apologetic about it. And sometimes they saw a sign um, as a necessary evil. And when I said that, um, both the the chair of my committee and the audiologist cringed, and so I took it out of the thesis. But the deaf student who was on my team did not cringe when I said that. Next slide. And then again, what are their attitudes and beliefs of audiology students about their role in the educational system? And this was the question that grew out of the study. The audiologists see themselves as part of the medical team. And the responsibility of the audiologist towards parents is to tell parents about their options. And they seem to see this as a one time event. You can either go this or that way. And they saw that, and then they would refer them somewhere. Four students saw the role as informative or educational, but the two students who scored the lowest saw their role as more directive. They said they would talk to parents about using technology and pursuing spoken language. They all said that they would refer to parent support or a connection organization, although none of them knew of a parent support or organization. They had never thought about a referral to a deaf adult. And their range on this, because, well, let me back up and say they had never thought about a referral to deaf adult. They never mentioned that. I asked them, well, who would you refer the student to or the parents to? And they never said a deaf adult. So I asked them. Their attitudes ranged from everything from one student who thought it was the best idea they'd ever heard. That's a great idea. I should do that. To one student who said, absolutely not. I would never refer a parent of a deaf child to a deaf adult. They saw themselves as outside of the educational system. They did not see themselves as part of the educational system, and they saw no reason to refer their children to school, even though it's a requirement of the law. Next slide. The artifacts, the deaf culture class assigned reading. I read Words Made Flesh, the 19th Century Deaf Education System and Growth of Deaf Culture, which I'm not actually sure the students were assigned to read the whole book. And then Language Literacy Development and Spoken English Development among Native Signing Children with Cochlear Implants. And then I read the scopes of practice of the American Speech and Hearing Association and the American Academy of Audiology. Next slide. So the words made flesh made it clear that students may develop an appreciation and understanding of the nature and depth of the argument for those who advocate for ASL English bilingualism. The articles were both concluded that ASL does not interfere with spoken language development. The scopes of practice were traditional medical model of disability, and the students had a more social cultural view of being deaf than their professional organizations. Both organizations stressed the role of the audiologist in the schools, but the students did not see their own role in the schools. So they did not actually agree with their scopes of practice, interestingly. Next slide. So the recommendations I made to the audiology students, and I did visit them again, was to use social cultural rather than medical terminology. Don't use those terms, hearing loss. Don't talk about being normal. Consider the devastating effect of language deprivation, not just auditory deprivation, on deaf children. They only talked about auditory deprivation. Replace the term communication options with language opportunities. The reason was that communication options makes it sound like they have to choose, which the audiology students actually thought they did have to choose. Opportunities makes it sound like they can choose one or the other or both. Provide all information about all language opportunities to all deaf and hard of hearing children and their families. I did not know that they separated out hard of hearing kids and did not provide them with opportunities. Next, I said adopt a more inclusive definition of deaf culture so that you don't see it as limiting and that you don't see it as discriminating against people who are hard of hearing or people who wear hearing aids. Next, I said study more ASL. Ask that ASL be included in the curriculum. It was at one time and it had been taken out. They all said they didn't know where they all said there was no opportunity for them to learn sign language in their community. They lived in a large town and there were tons of opportunities for them to learn sign language, but they didn't know any of them. Seek more involvement with the deaf community and see teachers of the deaf and deaf adults as partners in the parents' decision-making journey. And I talked about the decision-making journey. I said it is not a one-time event and that people who are deaf and teachers of the deaf should be included in that. Next slide. Any questions? And here is my email address. I tried not to go over my 30 minutes, but I may have.
As you know, I have seen your presentation before, and it seems like we get the same list of questions over and over again at these types of presentations. So, right now, I feel like I was recently chatting with my daughter, walking her dogs, and I was chatting with her and saying, I was going to your presentation tonight, and just, kind of having a thoughtful discussion about how we really can improve education and improve deaf education. So I think the question is there any reason why the deaf community isn't involved and why the deaf community continues to not be involved in deaf education? And do you have any thoughts about that?
You know, I was shocked by that, and that the students in audiology had absolutely no connection with the deaf community and didn't see a reason to connect with the deaf community. And so I guess I do not know why that is. So I made that a recommendation to them that they need to include deaf adults in their studies. I did visit one class and they had a deaf adult come and speak to them. And he was a deaf adult who'd grown up with C signs. He was very much a C signer. Um, and I think that probably was the only deaf adult they ever met. I'm not positive.
Hmm. So you give us no solution.
I did suggest to the students that they should include, deaf people in their studies. That they should introduce parents to to deaf people. That they should incorporate deaf people in the decision making journey for parents. So I did make that as a recommendation for the students.
And were you aware that Hands and Voices, the family learning, I think it's FL3, they highly recommend the inclusion of deaf people. Have you seen
Right,
on their programs
right,
website? It outlines that that's something that's important, and it says that it's important. So it's there
exactly.
in on their informational pages, but it seems like other than lead K, people are not really encouraging families to meet deaf adults, which is puzzling. Okay. So I see another question here. Do you think that audiology students realize or are cognizant of this conflict between the medical and cultural social approach? Do they even are they even aware that there are two different approaches? I mean, do
No,
they realize and do they see there's a conflict?
no, they did not know. And what was interesting was one of the students asked me why I was doing the study. And this is where it became a bit transformational. Um, I said, "Well, I was doing this study because I wanted to know what your attitudes and beliefs about deaf people are." And she said, "Oh, I've never thought about. I've never thought that there was a disagreement between audiology students and deaf people. That just never occurred to me." And she said, "We can all learn. We can all learn new things." And so she sat back, I said um, she or he sat back and and thought about that, and it was really good. It was really great.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Let's see. And unless something else pops up between now and then, I see a question here. We do have 12 minutes left, so another one could pop up, but let's go with this one that I'm seeing here. So if they, as audiology students, they know ASL is a language, and they are aware about the critical period, the theory of language acquisition and the critical period. But then that doesn't lead them to recommend ASL, right? I mean, is that still that's the sense, that's the finding you got from the data you collected, correct?
They very much saw as that parents had to choose between American Sign Language and the technology route. And that technology route included learning to listen and speak. And they saw them as very separate. They did not, only one student saw them like students can do both. But the other five students said no. Um, and and they saw this as a one-time deal. And so when parents are told your child can learn to listen and speak, or your child can go the ASL route, which do you want to do? Of course parents are going to go this way because that's what they do. Um, and they didn't see this as they talked a lot about auditory deprivation. They didn't talk about language deprivation at all. And but one student, I asked this student because she was talking about um, children need to learn sounds because they don't have, or because they have this window of opportunity to learn sounds and to acquire listening and spoken language. And so I asked that person, but don't you think it's the same window of opportunity for learning American Sign Language? And that person sat back and went, I guess it would be. So she had never thought about it, but thinking about it made her made her realize that they are the same.
So would you think with all of this, with about these attitudes and these beliefs that we're discussing, they're really that ingrained in the university programs or in the instructors, and are they really teaching it? Are they espousing it in these programs, or is it just something that's a part of the larger majority, the social political climate, that kind of thing? Or do you think that there is something in the instruction that is in also instructing those things?
I think that's a very good question. And I actually think that it's because they're hearing. And and so I don't think they've actually been taught those things necessarily, although the teacher who was teaching the deaf culture class was hearing, which surprised me. you know, why would a hearing person teach deaf culture? But and then the guest speaker was a person who'd been raised with C signs. Um, I was kind of surprised by that. So yes, I think it's both. I think that they're hearing, And so they've grown up hearing, and hearing people just tend to be autists. I think that it's ingrained in us. I mean, I include myself in this. And that but some autists, it's kind of like racism, you know. Um we are all a little bit racist. Some people recognize our racism and some people do not. And so when it's pointed out to us, we can recognize it or not. And so that was my point in doing this study, is talking to these students about, gosh, have you thought about referring parents to deaf adults? Or have you thought about the window of opportunity being the same for American Sign Language as it is for um, listening and spoken language? And they began to change their attitudes a little bit, but I do think it's both. I think that they've grown up hearing, and secondly, they're in this audiology program that is just not encouraging them to get to know deaf adults and um, to learn American Sign Language. Like I said, it used to be part of the curriculum and it was taken out. I don't know why.
So we don't know any reason for, oh, we don't know why. Hmm, interesting.
I think that probably it was
Oh, yeah, please
oh,
continue.
I think that probably the reason it was taken out was that there were too many units that the students had to acquire, and they looked at the list of those classes and they said, "Oh, that one can go." And I don't think it should have, but that was the one they chose.
I think you would make a great audiology instructor. I'd love to see you in an audiology program. So we don't have any more questions here in the chat. So I think since we don't have anything left from the audience, any questions, comments, or concerns? Or maybe why don't you give us your closing thoughts?
My closing thoughts are that, hmm, um, I would like to see audiology programs change their attitude, and that they would that first of all, if they teach deaf culture in this program, maybe they should teach it with a deaf teacher. um, I would like to see the attitudes and beliefs of audiology students towards people who are deaf become more positive. Yes, that would be my closing thought.
Absolutely. I think they're great closing thoughts. And you know my thoughts about this presentation. And I just want to
Yes.
reiterate the value of your data. I don't always have to say everything I'm thinking. You did it. We get. I love the data. I think it's beautiful. I think it's really highlights some great findings. Um, I just, as somebody who just finished their own program, I know what good data looks like, and I think it's great to have this kind of data to support change. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for
Thank
coming
you.
and presenting and sharing your data with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.